Hey everyone. So I ended our last talk saying that it was good news that the next words we would read in Romans would be "but now." As I'm sure you know, the word "but" signals a change in the direction of a story. As in, I was going to go to work today, or I was going to go to school today, but the coronavirus made it so I had to stay home. And so the story of another day at work or at school turns into the story of a day at home during a pandemic, right? So let me refresh the storyline that we've been following in our last talk. We were currently on the part about how no human being was able to justify themselves by their works before God, which is a bummer because according to Romans 2:6, that same God will, quote, render to each one according to his works. So we'll be judged by our works, but we can't be justified by our works, which just leaves a guilty verdict in our future, essentially. That's why we should breathe a huge sigh of relief when we read, "but now," because we desperately need a change in the direction of this story. And this change of direction is better than we could have ever hoped for. Let's look at it. Verses 21 through 22. "But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe." Now, remember, the story of Romans and the gospel that Paul preaches, it's all about the righteousness of God being revealed, according to Romans 1:17. Also remember that the standard of righteousness in question here, that God is looking for, is God's own righteousness. And that's based on what Jesus said. And here we find it. We find the righteousness of God, not based on works, though, which will never justify us, but based on faith in Jesus. So all of a sudden, the story changes from one in which no one can be justified to one in which anyone and everyone can be justified through simple faith. Like I said, it's a better change of direction to the story than we could have ever hoped for. So, starting at the end of 22 and then going through the first part of 25, we get one of the best known and succinct explanations of the gospel in the entire Bible. It goes like this: "For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, to be received by faith." Okay, it's understandable why these verses are so famous, are so popular. They're packed. So let's look at them a phrase at a time. First, the lack of distinction that's mentioned at first applies both to the fallenness of all men and to the availability of salvation for all men that Paul talks about next. The point about falling short is essentially a summary of what we've talked about in the last couple of talks. It's a summary of Romans 1:18 through 3:20, really. So we've gone over that in the last couple of talks. And then we finally get to the message of salvation. What's God's fix for all this? We're justified by grace as a gift. Now, you guys remember what justification is, right? Just as if I never sinned, right? That was Cole's thing. We appreciate that. We are given the stamp of righteousness, the stamp of divine righteousness as a gift that we could never earn on our own. That's what it means that we are justified by grace as a gift. Next, we are redeemed, or we are purchased out of slavery by Jesus. Remember back in chapter 1 how God gave sinners up to their sins? Well, sin became our master. We became sin's slaves. Jesus redeemed us out of that slavery. He purchased us out of that slavery. And he did this by being a propitiation for us. A propitiation is a wrath bearer. A wrath bearer. Again, remember God's wrath from chapter 1, verse 18. Jesus bore all of that, as an infinitely satisfying sacrifice, Jesus was able to exhaust the wrath of an infinite God, the infinite wrath of God towards sin. And all of this is received by faith. Again, Paul's gospel is one in which the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith. It's all about faith. It all comes through faith. Okay, what does all this have to do, or what does all this reveal about God? Paul's about to tell us in the rest of 25 down through 26. It says this: this was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be the just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. So, God's righteousness is shown in two things in these verses. First, it is shown in his divine forbearance. That's a fancy way of saying his crazy patience with sin. This God, who hates sin more than any of us can possibly imagine, quote, passed over former sins without doling out the deserved punishment for those sins from the creation of the world all the way up until the crucifixion of Jesus, when that punishment was finally served. That's crazy patience. Second, his righteousness is shown in the fact that he didn't simply let the sin go, though. He didn't let it go unpunished. He was patient, incredibly patient with sins, but he didn't ultimately let those sins go unpunished. Jesus took the full punishment for all who have faith in him. And so, God is just because he punished sin as his righteousness, as his justice required, but he is, quote, the justifier because he made a way in Jesus for sinners to avoid his terrible wrath and destruction. Recall again God's self-description found in Exodus 34, in which he describes himself as, quote, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. So he's going to forgive sin, but he's not going to clear the guilty of their sin. So how does that work out? It doesn't make sense to us. Well, in this passage, we have the answer to how God resolved that seeming tension in the very core of his character. In Jesus, God bore the punishment his justice demanded. In Jesus, God bore the punishment his justice demanded. He's the just and the justifier. Then in verses 27 through 30, Paul gets at how we should respond to all this. Then what becomes of our boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By a law of works? No, but by the law of faith. For we hold that one is justified by faith apart from works of the law. Or is God the God of Jews only? Is he not the God of Gentiles also? Yes, of Gentiles also, since God is one who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith. So, what Paul's getting at here is if our standing before God is a gift received by faith, what do we have to boast in? His answer? Nothing. Nothing. We have nothing to boast in. Our very best efforts fall short. So boasting is simply an indication of foolishness. It's an indication that we don't understand that our best efforts have fallen short. And Paul wants to be very clear, since, again, he's talking to a mixed crowd of Jews and Gentiles, that since righteousness comes by faith apart from the law, Mosaic law or any other law, the righteousness of God is available to everyone the same, Jew or Gentile. And then verse 31 says this: do we then overthrow the law by this faith? By no means. On the contrary, we uphold the law. So here Paul is simply setting up the next issue he's going to be dealing with in Romans, and that is the issue of the relationship between this faith that justifies apart from the law and the law. So we'll look at that in our next talks and in some subsequent talks after that as well. To close, let's simply recall what we've just read, what we've just looked at. We fell short in our works. We fell short of the glory of God. So God gave us righteousness as a gift by redeeming us through Jesus, who took all the wrath God had against sin. This resolved the tension at the core of God's character as one whose love drove him to forgive, but whose justice drove him to punish sin. So our response to this great salvation, that this loving, just, gracious, wrathful, merciful, righteous God worked for us in Jesus, is to humbly accept this gift of his righteousness that he offers. What a privilege to consider this great salvation on Easter, right? The pinnacle celebration of our salvation. In the next chapter, Paul's going to say that Jesus was, quote, raised for our justification. He was raised for our justification. The resurrection is the stamp of God's approval on what Jesus accomplished for us. It's God's stamp of approval on what Jesus accomplished for us. Basically, we can know that Jesus paid our debt because God raised him from the dead. Jesus said, "It is finished." Easter is the celebration of the resurrection, which was God's way of saying, "You're right. It is